Howdy doody everyone, Wambu here. First of all, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Before we really begin though, I gotta explain some things. This is probably gonna be one of my more self-indulgent countdowns, so I want to apologize if this doesn't end up being the most newcomer-friendly video. Bear with me though, I shall get to the good stuff shortly. So, half a year ago, I uploaded a video called Why I Haven't Been Uploading Recently. In this video, I explain why it takes me so long to make these countdowns. The short explanation is this. College is hard and takes up too much time. I've done the science, it's a statistical fact. Yeah, school has cracked down on me hard in these last couple of semesters, and yet, in spite of that, I've actually been able to play quite a lot of games during my downtime. So, first of all, I wanted to give you guys a brief update on what's been going on with me, but mostly I wanted to talk to you all about 10 games that I've really been enjoying over the last couple of months. Just to clarify, these are not all games that came out this year, just games I happened to play recently. Most of the games on this list are pretty modern, but not all of them. With that kinda long disclaimer out of the way, let's begin. Right out of the gate, I'm kinda copping out for this one. I put this game in the bottom spot not because it's the game I liked the least out of the bunch, but because it's the one that I don't really want to talk about, at least for now. I've been asked about this game over and over again, so let me finally say definitively, yes, I've played it, and yes, I do plan to make a video about it in the hopefully not too distant future, but hey, you know me, I make you guys wait all the time, and I know y'all love me for that, but actually, I am so incredibly sorry. Please don't hate my guts. In spite of the placing on this list, I'm not actually super inclined to be nice to Bendy and the Ink Machine. At first, I dismissed this game as just being another run-of-the-mill horror game that basically just throws jump scares at people. But I don't know, this one managed to stand out in that they made Mickey Mouse the bad guy. Seriously though, this game is such a weird mix of blatant cliches that can be seen coming a mile away, and some actually fairly original ideas. In this game, you play as Henry, a former traditional animator who's returning to his old workplace after being invited by his friend and former co-worker Joey. The goal of the game is to turn on the titular machine that powers the studio, and over the course of the game you learn that good old Joey, well, for one, is just awful at maintaining a studio, but also he maybe went kinda crazy. Not a bad concept, but I can't really say its method to presenting its story or even its plot points are all that original. Plus, even as horror games go, its scares are just kind of underwhelming a lot of the time. Oh my god, it's fucking cardboard. Like, who cares?
Hold it right there!
Oh hey, it's Metkaratsu Mizuhiro, everybody.
Hold the applause! Wambu?
Yes?
Did you seriously just say that Bendy and the Ink Machine is... cliché?
Yeah.
Well, Wambu, I'm gonna have to explain some stuff to you then.
Oh no.
For one, at the time of recording, the game is only 2 chapters. As Wambu has failed to mention throughout this entry, the second chapter expands on the game greatly by adding new gameplay functions, secrets, enemies, and puzzles. Lots and lots of puzzles, while also going deeper into the story.
Okay, I can agree with that for the most part. Chapter 2 definitely seems more ambitious, but I still can't really say I was super blown away or anything. At the very least, it's definitely shown enough promise to keep my interest, but I also feel like it could just as easily end up being as bland as wheat toast.
At the same time though, the game is still in an early enough phase that it's still regularly getting updated. So it makes sense that it wouldn't have too much to offer. At the end of the day, it's only 45 minutes of gameplay.
That's fair enough, I suppose. Honestly, you tend to make more content on the game than I do. So is there any insight you want to add to the entry?
No!
Alright, moving on then. I'm not gonna lie, of all the games on this list, this is the one that probably embarrasses me the most. Not because of the game itself, obviously, but because I now have to reveal that Birthright is the only game in the Fates trio that I've played, and even more embarrassing, the only Fire Emblem game I played before this one was Awakening. I'm throwing my hands up for this one, I am a filthy fucking casual. I think for most of my life, I just sort of ignored Fire Emblem because it didn't really look like my type of thing, but Awakening changed my mind in an instant, and Birthright is basically more of what I liked from that game. A great soundtrack, some beautiful visuals, fun strategy RPG gameplay that could really up the ante when it wanted to, and a cast of characters that I didn't think were as good as Awakening's, but were still pretty likable and tangible within the game's world. And to top it off, there's shipping. Just so much pairing, and getting people married, and meeting their kids, and getting their kids married, and closing the 3DS, and pondering your life choices. It's a very enthralling experience. I wouldn't say I like Birthright as much as Awakening. I'm not quite as big on the story, the cast, or the support conversations, and while the tangential stuff in the hub area did make the army feel a lot more united, it also kinda killed the pacing a lot of the time. But you know what? I'm kinda glad this and Awakening were my first Fire Emblem experiences, because it certainly got me excited to try other games in the franchise. Maybe one day I'll actually be able to talk about it without sounding like a scrub. And now for a game that proves that with an inspired enough concept and charming enough execution, even the most tired of themes can feel fresh. Even zombie survival, of all things. In this game, you and your posse try and live through a zombie apocalypse, and the only safe haven is this fictitious mystical wonderland of merriment called Canada. Supposedly it's north of the United States. I don't buy it either. Death Road to Canada is a lot like Oregon Trail, but with a lot more top-down zombie combat and a lot less dying from dysentery. The main gameplay is spent fighting zombies while gathering resources such as gas, food, medical supplies, weapons, and ammo. But there's also quite a lot of customizability to the whole experience. You can make your own characters and influence their skills in the form of traits and perks. So you can design a character to be really practical for a specific purpose, like having them be a good mechanic or doctor. But then there's always the fun way of designing a character, i.e. making them a complete nutcase that only ever solves problems in the most obtuse, inappropriate ways possible. And when you have all this juxtaposed with humor and totally random bullshit, you get a perfect recipe for a game that's replayable as hell without ever being too enraging. But of course, the funnest thing to do is create a bunch of your friends, even Ed Boy, and bring them along for the ride. Now, if only the multiplayer wasn't local only, then I might have actually been able to play the game with other people. You know, supposedly the people that live there are called Canadians. Yeah, to me it just sounds like a bunch of conspiratorial bullshit, but hey, what can I say? The lore really runs fucking deep with this one. This next game is only 3 hours long. It took 6 years to make. That's not to sell it short by any means. This is Playdead's follow-up to Limbo, their game from 2010. And like Limbo, it's a puzzle platformer with heavy emphasis on its haunting, lonely atmosphere. But while I liked Limbo quite a bit, I thoroughly enjoyed Inside even more. It uses lighting and color in a way that's able to direct the player's attention masterfully. Plus, it feels to me like it just has a bit more depth. Well, literally it has more depth. It's a 2.5D platformer. But I also mean in regards to its cryptic storytelling. It feeds information to the player not through any dialogue, but through just the world itself, the people you come across, and the environments you explore. And as the game progresses, the imagery becomes much more abstract as it starts to expose commentary on control and individuality. Now, of course, the ambiguity kinda makes it fly over the heads of peanut brains like myself, but when the presentation is this compelling, it's hard not to be totally absorbed. Now, I don't want to spoil too much, but I will say it's not exactly the easiest game to be totally satisfied with. And yet, in spite of that, it really stuck with me. Also, like Limbo, you can die in kinda horrible ways. That's not funny. That's tragic. And you are terrible if you left it. Fuck. Most of the games on this list are fairly modern. Either they're games that came out this year, or last year, or the year before, and really with these games I played lists, it's bound to happen. It's not really unusual to miss a game by a year or two. Or 12.
What? That's insane!
So I've played Metroid Prime and Prime 3, but I had never actually played Prime 2 until just recently. Crazy, right? But now I have played it, and the elements of the universe are in harmony once again. I think the general consensus is that of the Prime trilogy, 2 is the weakest. And while I'm not necessarily inclined to disagree, that's just being unfair to a game that really has a lot going for it. In this game, Samus crash lands in a planet called Aether, with an alternate dimension known as Dark Aether. Aether's natural energy is protected by a race of moth people called the Luminoth. They're pretty awesome, but they're also getting wrecked by the Ing, the shape-shifting creatures from Dark Aether that basically just want to kill shit and control everything. They're the bad guys, if you couldn't tell. Now, the core gameplay is pretty much the same as the first Prime game, but the big curveball comes in having to regularly switch between exploring the two dimensions, effectively making the player adjust their playstyle based on what world they're in. Dark Aether's atmosphere is hazardous and will slowly kill you unless you're in a light bubble, so you really don't have the same freedom to roam around like you would in normal Aether. The light and dark motif also carries over to your weapons, as the game introduces the light and dark beams pretty early on. They're both needed for certain doors, puzzles, and enemies as you'd expect, but there's also a neat idea in that killing enemies with one beam gives you ammo for the other. And while I'm actually not wild on how it was pulled off, the gameplay itself still feels good. And the enemies... oh my god, the enemies. I don't praise games for this very often, but the enemy designs are really cool. Not only are they super imaginative, but a bunch of them have dark counterparts that add a whole new layer of intimidation to each of them. If I had to point out some things I don't like about the game, I'd say I kinda miss some of the more natural looking environments, even if the levels from Echoes are still cool in their own way, and I also wish the practicality of the light and dark beams was just a little less inhibiting, but at this point, I'm kinda just reaching. This game is great, and really, if this is widely considered to be the weakest of the Prime games, that should speak volumes to the quality of the trilogy as a whole. This one is going to require some explaining. No, I did not just recently play Shovel Knight. In fact, I finished it up a while ago. In case you don't know though, Yacht Club Games is amazing, and they created two separate campaigns based around the two most interesting boss characters. Originally, I was going to single out Plague of Shadows for this list, but while I was writing, Spectre of Torment came out. Now, I personally think the original Shovel Knight game is amazing, with brilliant mechanics and level design that makes for a challenge with a difficulty curve as smooth as butter. And this is coming from a guy who has never cared about true NES difficulty, so getting two more campaigns of that is a plus for me, which is why the whole package is on the list, even though I'm only going to be talking about these two. Brace yourselves, because this entry may be quite long. Now, Spectre of Torment, the most recent one, tells a prequel story, in which Spectre over here is tasked with recruiting the Night Bosses to the Order of No Quarter. The levels and bosses are changed quite a bit from the other two campaigns. Some of them are even overhauled completely. That's definitely a good thing for the record. Having the same levels a third time would be pretty excessive. One other thing that really stuck out to me was just how much the surroundings acted as a determinant for Spectre's mobility. On his own, he can run and jump off walls, but he's pretty slow, he doesn't jump high, and his default slashing attack is completely stationary. Put him around lanterns or enemies or rails, however, and suddenly he can zip around the screen and grind around on his scythe. Now, do I have issues with Spectre of Torment? Boy howdy, yes I do. The wall running and the charge attacks are not always responsive. It's really common to accidentally run up the same wall 12 times. A handful of the boss fights are way too goddamn easy, including the final fight, and all the levels are unlocked right off the bat, so I can't really praise the difficulty curve as much. At this point, you may be thinking, well gee, Wambu, that actually sounds like quite a lot. Does this game really deserve to be ranked higher than games like Inside or Metroid Prime 2? No. I do like Spectre of Torment, but at the end of the day, it's Plague of Shadows that puts the treasure trove over the top. I can't front on this, okay? I loved Plague of Shadows. Unlike Spectre of Torment, this campaign takes place during the main game as more of a goofy side story. This time, you're the jittery alchemist Plague Knight, and therein lies a pretty big difference right out of the gate. I adore this guy, both in character and in gameplay. In contrast to both Shovel Knight and Spectre Knight, Plague Knight feels very mobile and free, with a double jump and an explosive triple jump. More than that, though, he's super customizable. His main method to attacking is throwing bombs, but by changing the powder, fuse, and casing, you can completely alter how it functions. It also makes the game fun to talk about with other people, since everyone seems to have their own preferred combinations. Now maybe this sounds kind of ridiculous. The game doesn't really change any of the levels all that much, and you could argue that it really doesn't complement Plague Knight in the same way as Shovel Knight. Plague of Shadows could be seen as the worst of the campaigns from a gameplay perspective. I think more than anything though, it just has so much character. It throws a wrench into the Shovel Knight campaign in a lot of really likable ways. The story is basically a big romance drama, and the characters are pretty charming, especially Plague Knight himself, who is just a massive Dorcas. So yeah, I'm kind of playing favoritism with this entry, but at the end of the day, all three campaigns are some of the most masterfully designed 2D platformers you'll find today. And if you haven't picked up Treasure Trove already, just fucking do it! If recent years of gaming have taught me one thing, it's that funding a game through Kickstarter is basically a coin toss on whether or not it'll be any good. It's not too uncommon to wind up with disappointing bullshit like Mighty No. 9. On the opposite end, though, there's games like Undertales. No, that's not funny. Undertale, which ended up being my favorite game of 2015. And now in 2017, it looks like a similar deal is happening with something I'll get back to you guys on later. I'm a cheeky son of a bitch, yes sir I am. In the meantime, here's this. This may be kind of a funny way to start, but Night in the Woods is a game that I just enjoy thinking about. From a narrative standpoint, it's very unlike just about every other game I've played. In it, you play as May, who is returning to her hometown after saying fuck it and dropping out of college, the lucky bitch! Sorry, that was inappropriate. She's a female cat, not a female dog. But yeah, she dropped out of college because, as we established earlier, college is hard and takes up too much time. As she starts to reconnect with more of her old friends, she learns that the people and the town itself have changed quite a bit since she left. And setup-wise, that's about it. For a good chunk of the game, it's basically just May adjusting to her life in the face of not living up to others' expectations, and just hanging out with friends and enjoying the ride in whatever simple way she can. I gotta say, this game might have one of my favorite cast of characters. The four main guys are such a likable ensemble of friends. A bunch of the stuff they do and talk about is just total inane bullshit, which somehow gives it even more authenticity. Like, pizza scale? Who even cares? Me, obviously. It's as if the people who wrote it have actually heard young people speak to each other before. Life sure is strange, let me tell ya. You've got Greg, the super excitable guy that likes committing petty crimes, his stoic and very droll boyfriend Angus, and B, the gloomy, sarcastic childhood friend of May. And that's still without mentioning the tons of side characters who have their own stories and character arcs. But let's also not discredit the main character May, who is the snarkiest snark this side of snarkdom, in a good way. But more than that, is just a totally relatable character to anyone who's experienced the existential thoughts that come with transitioning from being a teenager to an adult. Now, the game does have a pretty lighthearted vibe a good chunk of the time, but eventually, without spoiling too much, it develops more of a central conflict, and it dives headfirst into themes of depression, mental illness, poverty, and just generally finding meaning in oneself and the rest of the world, even if you're just one of 7 billion lives. And then you're sitting there like, what the hell, I was playing a game about a talking cat, and now my life is sad. If I were to point out some negatives, I would say that I'm not wild about some of the plot's payoffs, and I also don't think the gameplay itself is all that good. It kinda gets the job done and nothing more. But in a game like this, where the focus is mainly on the writing and characters, that's more than excusable. On the flip side, sometimes a game might be made by one of the biggest companies in the industry. Sometimes the game gets hyped from millions of people the moment it's announced. Sometimes the game actually lives up to the expectations and gets flooded with perfect scores both from independent reviewers and gaming publications shortly after its release. Now, let me think. Was there a game that came out this year that may fit that bill? Oh yeah. I'm sure you guys have heard of this one. I really love Nintendo. However, I make countdowns on video games, so I am also very scared of them. They might copyright my shit and eat my channel. Am I even allowed to use gameplay footage right now? I have no idea. It's been an eventful year for Nintendo so far. Not only did they release a portable home console, but they also went perhaps literally actually crazy with 2 of their biggest franchises. And with Breath of the Wild, that fetish for innovation was channeled into something amazing. I kinda don't even know where to begin. Given the typical format of Zelda, an open-world game definitely makes a lot of sense. I just wasn't really expecting it to innovate on the staples to this extent. The combat retains the complexity from previous entries, but with more of an emphasis on weapon types and a mechanic based around dodging. The puzzles have been relegated mostly to shrines, and Link is given some new utilities to work with, like bombs that regenerate, and bombs that regenerate, but are also squares, and bombs that aren't actually bombs, it lets you freeze stuff. No, that's the one that creates ice blocks. That's the one that lets you freeze stuff. Now, while it may not sound too different, it's all wrapped around the more major changes to physics, to resource management, and to mobility. Physics is kind of self-explanatory. It influences a lot of the puzzles and hazards, while also being the basis for powers like magnesis. Oh yeah, that one lets you lift metal things, by the way. Resource management, on the other hand, is a bigger fish. In this game, Link breaks everything that he doesn't eat, so the weapons you find will break after a while, meaning you have to watch the frequency of your use or be able to dispose of them at opportune moments. There's also a cooking mechanic which allows you to mix the materials you find into elixirs or food, which of course restores your health and grants side benefits like enhanced strength or elemental immunity. It sounds kinda tedious, but honestly, it's way more addicting than it has any right to be. Lastly, there's mobility. mobility. Not only do you get equipped with a paraglider really early on, but Link also has the power to climb whatever he wants basically, so long as he's got the stamina. This can dramatically change the way the player might approach a situation, and also just makes exploring a ton of fun. And speaking of the exploration, it's no doubt that an open world Zelda game would kick things up a notch. Hyrule in Breath of the Wild isn't just huge though, it's dense. There's materials and shrines and quests and camps and towns to find absolutely everywhere. Plus the world is just designed brilliantly. It feels so organic, and yet at no point did the level design feel in any way contrived, or like it was trying to have me handle things in a really specific way. It certainly is the most open-ended 3D Zelda experience you'll find today. Now of course, in spite of the many perfect scores it's been getting, it's not a perfect game. Occasionally the physics puzzles get a tiny bit busted and require weird roundabouts to solving them, some of the quests have really cryptic solutions, and finding new weapons doesn't really feel all too special since they all break. Even the shields, even the bows, even your spine. But in spite of that, it's earned all of the hype. Already this game is being cited as an instant classic that'll have heavy influences on the open world genre, and it's not really hard to see why. For me though, there was only one game I played recently that just barely beat it out. I gotta admit, I don't entirely know how to begin this entry. All the other games on this list, for some reason or another, I've seen get quite a lot of notoriety, mostly for well-earned praise. My number one is a game that I happened to hear about from one of my friends, and I can throw almost all of the same praises onto it. So, let me tell you guys why the first release from indie developers Team Cherry is topping this list. For those who don't know, Hollow Knight is a 2D platforming action-adventure Metroidvania-style game. This was the second Kickstarter crowdfunded game I played recently, and I could just go on for hours about how this game pretty much works for me in every single regard. This was the game I got the most enjoyment from when I wasn't colleging the fuck out of myself. First thing that struck me right when I started it was its visuals. It's got this hand-drawn style that just looks fantastic. I want to have a million babies with it. It goes for a monochromatic color scheme, and yet it still manages to look lively and exciting. It gives each new area its own motif, making all the environments crazy memorable while still being believable in the interconnected world of Hollow Nest. Now I'll admit, Hollow Knight isn't really an innovative game. In fact, it's pretty easy to see where some of its influences come in. Its story, for example, takes a very Dark Souls method to explaining its narrative and world building. It never actually spells anything out to the player right away, instead it just lets you loose in this world and has you put the pieces together on your own. You're a tiny ghosty guy wielding a nail, there's bug people everywhere, and you're exploring a former kingdom that fell to ruin, probably because bug people have tiny brains. And that's all you're really given right off the bat. I know some might not like this kind of ambiguity, but I just ate it up. I was consistently impressed with the unorthodox ways in which the story was fed to me, and it felt great to just let the thoughts and the hype build with each new discovery. And without spoiling too much, there's a number of reoccurring NPCs, all with their own story arcs, and some of them can in fact die if you act in a certain way, which can really make you feel like you're having an impact on the world, albeit in a pretty upsetting way sometimes. Now, in terms of the gameplay, you've got kinda standard Metroidvania, with a slash, a dash, a wall jump, a double jump, and various other power-ups needed to access new areas. The main mechanic comes from your soul, which you gain by attacking enemies, and can also be used to regain your health or activate spells. It's not super complex by any regards, but it's built alongside level and enemy design that requires the kind of outside-the-box thinking that keeps the core gameplay consistently interesting and fun. And while we're on the topic of level design, surprise, surprise, I fucking love it. Too often do games like this really blur the line between difficult and cheap, but save for maybe a few moments that got under my skin, Hollow Knight never felt like it was just pulling totally unfair bullshit. It certainly is hard, but most of the threats are properly telegraphed. Not only that, but it's also open-ended to the point where I very rarely found myself not knowing where to go. You may need to take my words with a grain of salt though, cause this is the kind of atmosphere that I love so much, I probably wouldn't mind getting lost more in it. This game well and truly absorbed me. Even as I move on to try other games, I find myself repeatedly thinking back on the whole Hollow Knight experience. For me, it's easily one of my favorite games of 2017 so far, and possibly one of my new favorite games ever. We're only in the mid-year, so maybe something will come along and beat it out. If that doesn't happen though, I'd still be perfectly happy with this, cause Hollow Knight absolutely nails it. See, it's funny cause the weapon you use is a nail. That's seriously how I'm ending the video. I am a comedic genius.
That joke was fucking terrible.
Have you just been here the entire time?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, what do you expect me to do? Just leave?
Yes!
Well, fine then. God, stupid channeler. I tried to explain something he failed to realize, and what does he do? He fucking tells me to leave. God, what an asshole.
Fucking...